Hello, in this video we're going to discuss race and ethnicity. So first, let's distinguish between what is race and what is ethnicity. So race is usually associated with biology, and it's linked more to physical characteristics, particularly skin color. Hair texture is also something that is often used to categorize one's race. Ethnicity is a little bit different because it delves a little bit more into cultural background expression, heritage, and identification. So race tends to be a little bit more physical or characteristics, while ethnicity seems to be a little bit more cultural. So if you think of it, people who seemingly look the same race, maybe similar skin color, similar hair textures, that kind of thing, might be of different ethnicities. However, both of them are considered social constructs that we use to categorize distinct populations. And so that information came from National Geographic. The U.S. Census Bureau has a listing of the race classifications as being white, black, or African American. So those are used as the same group. American Indian or Alaska Native, those are the same group. Asian, and then Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. So those are the different groups that we have. Notice that Hispanic or Latino is not listed in the race classification because that is considered an ethnicity and not a race. So when you look at these listing of the U.S. Census Bureau, think about who this doesn't include. Is there a group that is missing that does not obviously fit into one of these categories? Also, what happens of people who are of mixed race? So they're made up of two or more races. So it might be that they're, black and white. It might be that they're Asian and black. It might be that they're Native Hawaiian and white. So what do we do in that case if there's not a mixed category option? Do they just choose which one, just randomly choose one if they're half and half? Or how does someone go about classifying in that regard? So I just Googled common ethnicities in America, and this is a listing of the top ones. So I'm going to pause for a second and let you guys look at the list here on the left-hand side. Make note of any changes or patterns that you see or inconsistencies you see or any questions you have. Okay, so now let's look at the questions on the other side. I noticed when I looked at this list some commonalities. So, what is the difference between Americans and Black Americans or white Americans? Americans were listed as one, but then there was also Black Americans, and then there was also listed white Americans. And what is the difference between African Americans and Black Americans? One, obviously, it would think African Americans would have heritage from Africa. And we did discuss that one might have a race of being dark skinned, brown or black, but might not necessarily be of African heritage. They might be from another country and just so happen to have dark skin. What is the difference between Hispanic Latino Americans and Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, etc.? So is Hispanic Latino just an overarching group, while Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, and other subgroups are specific ethnicities that are culture specific because Puerto Ricans are not necessarily going to follow all the same cultural heritage and background as Mexicans, but do they all fall underneath the Hispanic Latino Americans group? Or is it that all these subgroups are so convoluted that it's almost a choice of which you identify with rather than an actual biological or historical categorization? So, for example, later on in the list that I didn't put on this slide are things like Irish American, Italian American, Scottish American, and in that regard, most people from Europe are going to be a European country American, just like African American or people who hailed from Africa who are now Americans. My personal example is I would be a German American. My background, my family name, my surname is German. So at some point in my heritage, I lived in Germany. My ancestors lived in Germany. However, I don't have background on that. And as far as I know, my grandfather, my great grandfather, my great 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 grandfather, as far as I know, lived in America. So I've been an American as long as I can remember. So can I actually have an ethnicity or identify with an ethnicity that is German American when I really have no basis or background about Germany in terms of its culture, heritage, or practices. So, why does your ethnic group matter? If we're all just self identifying with the ethnic group or the race that we feel like we fit closely to, why does it even matter that we have an ethnic group? One reason is genetic differences. So, are certain ethnic groups have predisposition to illnesses? And there has been research to find that or certain races or certain ethnic groups the population seems to have more of this disease, maybe giving them a genetic predisposition to it. So that might be a reason why you might want to know what ethnic group you actually belong to or are related to. There's also cultural traits passed from generations. So if you do have a strong ethnic background with a certain closeness to an ethnic group, you'll see a lot of people want to pass on those cultural traits to their children and to their grandchildren. And so often that will keep the ethnic group alive in terms of their practices, beliefs, that kind of thing. Now, taking this into an educational construct, are there actual learning differences among these ethnic groups in regards to the way we teach them or the way that they learn? So, are we able to say, all students or most students from this ethnic group are going to learn this way, or most students from this ethnic group are going to have this learning preference? Are we able to say that? And so, two ways to look at that is asking yourself, what role do these ethnic groups play, and how do people's learning preferences and abilities come about? So, if you believe that people's learning preferences and abilities come about biologically, genetically, or by nature, then you might say, yes, knowing one's ethnic background will make a difference because people's genetic background make up their traits, which influence their learning preferences and abilities. So in that case, people who believe that, studies focusing towards that area would say yes, knowing one's ethnic background could affect that. Now, the people on kind of the other side of things believe that it's more of the environment. So, how you were raised, what you were exposed to at an early age, is what determines how you prefer to learn and your preferences. So in that case, the thoughts on that is that people are raised differently, but they might be raised in households with different culture, beliefs, and priorities, and that will determine a student's or a person's normal or perspective or belief system, which again could affect their predispositions or their approaches to learning. So if I grew up with an ethnic group or an ethnic background that really valued education, then I might certainly, as a student, have that. If I grew up in an ethnic group that spoke a certain language, and I am now going to school and not learning in that native language, then that could affect my learning preferences. So biological as well as environmental, nature versus nurture, both can affect, or both groups believe that your ethnic background could affect how you learn. They just do so differently. One is because genetically you're different because of your ethnic group, and the other one is your ethnic group will influence your culture, belief, and priorities, which then affects your environment. So, why is it important that a teacher knows about a student's ethnicity or race? And that's because there might be some common cultural beliefs and priorities based upon a certain ethnicity that will affect a student's willingness and preferences for learning. And that's good information to have when you're planning your lessons. It's good to know how my students prefer to learn, what my students need, so I can give that to them. However, when you do so, you want to be super careful about stereotyping because not all students from a certain ethnic background or race are going to have the same preferences. We can't say all black students are going to do this, all white students are going to do this, all students who are English language learners are going to do this. It's not generalized like that. So you have to be a little bit careful when you're determining those things because you don't want to stereotype. So let's think a little bit more about stereotyping. So think of your own race and or ethnic group and think of some common beliefs that you've heard people say about that race or ethnic group, and think of how that is true or not true for you. So I'll kind of give you an example of mine. So I am white. I am non-Hispanic white. So I am just my ethnic group again would be probably American. Technically, I'm probably German American, but I don't have any German ethnicity culture in my current day. I've been American as long as I can remember. So let's just focus on white. So let's think of some stereotypes about white non-Hispanic people. So, some might say that white people believe that they're better than other minority groups. Does that stereotype fit me? Absolutely not. I don't believe that I'm better than any other race or ethnicity. I believe that there are different backgrounds and cultures that make us different, perhaps, but that doesn't necessarily mean that anybody's better or worse. White people are typically hard workers with the American dream mindset, which means if you work hard, you can have anything that you want. And I personally somewhat fit that stereotype. I do believe that you can work hard, but I think that there are things that I don't think it is as simple as you work hard and you get whatever you want. I think that it's a little bit more complicated than that. So that stereotype kind of fits me, but not 100%. Some might say a stereotype of white people is that they don't understand the struggles of other minority groups. And that's probably true for me. I don't, I've only ever lived as a white non Hispanic female, so I don't understand the struggles or what it's like to be a white male or a non white male or a non white female or anything else. Another stereotype of white people is that they conform or try to conform to high standards of beauty, i.e., the Hollywood look, super thin, a lot of makeup, etc. I absolutely do not fit that mold. If you've ever seen me, you would know that I do not look like a Hollywood actress, and I'm perfectly okay with that. So, some of these stereotypes fit me, and some of those don't. So, I'm going to give you a second and let you pause and think of your race or ethnicity. Think of some stereotypes that you've commonly heard about that and decide, like I did, are those true, somewhat true, or not true for you personally? Okay, so probably what you've learned from this mini activity is that there's a lot of stereotypes that just don't fit people. And so, in that regard, we have to be super careful about stereotypes and saying all white people, all females, all males, all black people, because that's not something we can use to fuel our decisions we make about our students and how they need to be educated. So, let's do another activity. So, let's read the words listed here and make note of the first ethnic group that comes to mind. And this is another practice in stereotyping. So think of the word rich. What ethnic group or race do you think of when you think of that word? What about poor, educated, violent, hardworking, athletic, lazy, entitled, friendly, powerful, or humble? So, and even when you're doing this, you're probably thinking to yourself, wow, I'm being racist, or wow, I'm being super one-sided, or I'm definitely stereotyping. And a lot of people, when you go to do these activities, you just feel like this is wrong. Not all X type of person are this way. So you want to be very careful when you're looking at students because you want to make for absolute sure that you're not saying, well, because they come from this background, they are certainly this way. And so here's a way to kind of look at this. And this was kind of a shocking study that I read about that really helps you understand stereotypes. So in 2013, a Harvard professor published an article, and it was about the distortion of media imagery and how it affects people of certain races and stereotypes. So a minute before, just on the slide before, we talked about athletic. And so a lot of people would say, what ethnic group do you think of when you think of athletic? And a lot of people will say African American or black people tend to be more athletic than any other race. But actually, looking at the data, they found that there were 1,200 black professional athletes in U.S. sports, but there were 12 times more black lawyers than black athletes. There were 20 times more black dentists than black athletes. There were 15 more black doctors than black athletes. Now, in the media, what do we see a lot of? Black athletes. What do we not see a lot of? Black lawyers, black dentists, black doctors, even though the data actually shows that contrary. And so we also have to keep in mind when we're looking at these stereotypes, the actual data, as well as what the media and what we've learned from ingesting the media and how that can affect how we think about different subgroups. So let's look at a little bit more data. So I want to talk a little bit about the word minority. So first of all, what is a minority? So by definition, a minority is the opposite of the majority. And the majority, by definition, is what makes up the most of something. So if I have the majority of the time, I have most of the time. If I have the majority of the cookies, that means I have most of the cookies. So if we are talking about the majority of the population, we're talking about the biggest chunk of the population, which means the minority would be what doesn't make up most of the population. So think for a second, what ethnic groups make up the majority and what ethnic groups or races make up the minority. So based upon that information, let's see what the data actually says. So looking at this box, this information is from 2019, and it's the data on race and ethnicity from the Georgia Department of Education, and it is the percentage of students in Georgia schools. So I won't look at the numbers, but I'll just look at the percentages. So in 2019, 38.9% of the population were white. The school population in Georgia schools were white. In 2019, 36.6% of the students in Georgia were black. 16% were Hispanic, 4% were Asian, and then a 4% were something other than the ones listed here. So does that align to what is your thought of minority or majority? And so I'll kind of tell you what I typically think. So I've always heard that white was the majority and that black, Hispanic, Asian, and other were always minorities. We often hear them called minorities or people of color. However, looking at this data, are black or African American students really the minority in Georgia? Because we're looking at 36 and 38% between black and white. So to me, that says that black students are no longer a minority. So what does that, is that different than what you expected? So now let's look at some data across time. So the same resource, the Georgia Department of Education, but let's look at it 2019 as well as two other dates. So in this, we're looking at data from 2000 as well as 2010 and 2019, so almost 10 years apart on each of those. So I took out and looked at just the percentages. So in 2000, 53% of the students were white. In 2010, it went to 44%. In 2019, it went to 38%. So we can see a decrease over time. In 2000, 38% of the students were black. In 2010, 37. In 2009, 36. So we might say that this has remained pretty stable. It's been within 1 to 2 points of each percentage points of each other. So we will say the black population has pretty much remained stable between 2000, 2010, and 2020, which are basically a 20-year gap. Hispanic went from 5% to 12% to 16%. So it is on an increase. Asian went from 0.02, not 2, 0.02 to 3 to 4. So it had a bit of an increase the first 10 years, but not as much the second 10 years. So what does this data tell us? Well, it tells me that the white population has decreased slightly. We're not talking huge numbers on any of this, but decreased slightly. The black population has pretty much remained the same. The Hispanic population has increased slightly, and the Asian population increased the first 10 years, but not so much the second 10 years. And so that tells us what populations are growing and what populations are shrinking. Now, having said that, what does that tell us about the cultural perspective and backgrounds of our students? So if we're looking at not as much of a split between black and white as we might have originally thought, a decrease in white but an increase in Hispanic, what does that tell us about who our students are? And how is this going to affect what and how we teach? Now I'll let you see really quickly where that data is, where I got this data from, and how you can actually look at it for yourself. So on this website, you're actually able to choose your year, and they actually take the data on October and March of the year. So I just chose the October date because that's the fall date. So let's look way back. Let's look at like 94. So we'll choose October 1994. And then you can select your school district. So you can choose whatever district or county you want to look at. I just selected statewide, so it includes all counties in Georgia. And then we get the report. And notice that it reports by gender, so it breaks it apart by female as well as male. And then it tells you ethnicity. So it looks at Hispanic, American Indian, Asian, Black, white, or multiracial. Now, it doesn't define what multiracial is. A mixing of two races, but it's not necessarily black and white. It might be white and Asian. It might be black and American Indian. It could be, as long as it's two races mixed together, two or more, then that's going to be considered multiracial. And then it just gives you the total here. So if you just want to look at total students, you can do it in this column. But it also breaks it apart by grade level. So you can look at how many were in pre-K, how many were in K, how many were in first grade, how many were in second grade. So if you wanted to know statewide how many female Asians were in first grade, there were 718. If you wanted to know how many just females there were in pre-K in 1994, there were 5,794. If you wanted to get percentages, so if I wanted to know how many, what it was the percentage of white students altogether in 1994, I would add white. I would add in this column female white, and then I would add in female male, and then divide that by the statewide total to get a percentage. So that's some interesting data that you can use to look at a snapshot 1994, or again, you could collect that data and then move it to another year and get that report for either statewide or just a district. And then you can see and compare that data of how these ethnicities or races are growing or shrinking. All right, so now that we know the differences between race and ethnic groups, as well as we know kind of the percentages that we're working with, how do we go about teaching race and ethnic groups? Because despite how large or small, or who's a minority or who's a majority, you're still probably going to have percentages of all students in your classroom of different race and ethnic groups. So how do we go about teaching these students? There's two main approaches or two sides of the fence that people tend to go for. One is the colorblind approach, where they attempt not to see color. So we say color or ethnicity in this regard. When I say color, I'm not speaking only of race, but color, race, ethnicity doesn't matter at all. We're not going to see any differences. We're going to treat everyone as a human, and we're going to treat everyone the same. And so it's kind of a one size fits all. And a lot of people do this to make it seem fair. So if I don't see your race, I don't see your ethnic background, I don't see any of that, then I can't treat you differently. Therefore, everyone's getting the same. It's going to be fair. So that's one approach. The other approach is kind of on the other side of the fence, and that's the multicultural approach. Now, it does see ethnic groups, races, and color. It makes notes of these differences and celebrates these differences. So it says, yeah, Black people have a different background, heritage, sometimes belief systems, sometimes preferences than white people, than Hispanic people. It acknowledges all of these differences and celebrates them. It has discussions of race and racism. So we talk about different color. We talk about how sometimes there can be uncomfortable conversations or stereotypes or misunderstandings about one's race or ethnic background. We talk about these things, we acknowledge these. Also, multicultural approaches attempt to understand different perspectives, culture, background, and teaches accordingly. So the teacher is trying to understand how is the Black student perspective different than the white student perspective, different than the Latino student perspective. We acknowledge that these perspectives can be slightly different, and I need to know about them to be able to teach that student accordingly. And so, in that respect, it's more responsive than the colorblind approach because we are actually tapping into the differences in the students. So some people choose either approach. Now, a common question is, do we strip students of their uniqueness? So if you are, different races, different ethnic groups, do we strip you of all of that in order to be fair? So do we take away all of your perspectives, cultural background, that kind of thing in order to make you all on an even playing field to teach you fairly? Or is there a way to celebrate a person's uniqueness in regards to their perspective, culture, background, heritage, without taking away from another subgroup? So, are we somehow able to say, let's celebrate the perspective of African American children or the background of white children or the culture of Hispanic children without taking anything away from the other subgroups that don't fall into that category? Are we somehow able to maneuver that? So, a common thing that you'll hear among teachers is, I know I have a bias. We all have a bias. A bias is, this is what I'm used to, this is what my thoughts are, this is my background, therefore, this is what I think. Now, that is not racist. Everyone has bias, everyone has preferences, everyone has background understanding. So, that doesn't make them racist. Um, but you have to understand what your bias is. Because I know I have a bias and I want to make sure that I nor my students are imposing racism by mistake, which is what most teachers fear, is that I know I have a bias. I don't want to be a racist person. I don't want to misinterpret or categorize my students inappropriately based upon their race or ethnic group. So, how do I go about making sure that I don't do that? And so, here are a couple of strategies. So, number one, check your bias. Accept and understand that you have a bias because of your environment, your background environment, and that's okay. We were all raised differently. We were all raised with different backgrounds, cultures, and understandings, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you want to make sure that you learn to question your backgrounds. So you learn to say, I always thought this, but is that right? Or I always thought this about this type or this group. Is that accurate? So you want to make sure to constantly check yourself to better understand where your race and your ethnic falls into the mix, as well as what you think about other groups. Also, you want to avoid making assumptions and avoid those stereotypes. And one way to do that is to remember that there is never an all. There is never all black people do this, all white people do this, all females do this, all males do this. There's no all in anything. So you kind of have to take it on a per situation basis. So expanding upon that, you want to get to know your students personally. So we're not taking away their race or ethnicity using the colorblind approach. We're trying to understand their own unique cultural background, perspective, and beliefs. And one way to do this is to ask them questions. Most students and most people are very willing to explain, this is what I believe, this is how I was raised, these are my thoughts, this is my priorities, these are my perspectives. People are willing to give you that information. So one way to get that from students is to do little surveys, to ask them questions like, how do you like to be taught? If I were going to do a lesson, choose between these types of activities that you would find most interesting and most fun. How do you like to learn? Do you like for me to tell you things? Do you like for me to give you visuals? Do you like to be able to work in groups? Do you prefer to work alone? Just let them ask these questions. Also, you can ask them about behavioral type questions. So, if you do something wrong, how do you prefer to be corrected? Do you like missing recess? Would you prefer to write a letter home to your parent? What do you think is going to be the most effective for you? So giving them a say in it helps you learn the students personally to help you also avoid stereotypes. You also want to try to have an inclusive classroom, and that's actually relatively easy to do. You just want to make a point to diversify your classroom to make every race, gender, ethnic group, etc., is being represented. And one way to do that is to, like in your classroom library, just making sure all races and genders and other subgroups are being represented. So you're having books about females, you're having books about black or Hispanic people, either historical figures or even modern day people. You have books about students with disabilities. You have books about people who are learning English or who have backgrounds with different cultures. It can also work even in math class, so making sure to use your students' names on word problems, or at least names that are not typically white or black or Hispanic. Try to use a diversity there. So simple things can make a difference. And the last thing is you don't want to make a student an expert on his or her race or ethnicity, which we have a tendency to do. Oftentimes, you might have one or two Hispanic students in your classroom, and we have a tendency to make them the know all of the Hispanic culture, background, or heritage. Keep in mind, as we studied before, while a student might be Hispanic, they might have different ethnicities. So I can't say, tell me about the Mexican perspective if the student is from Puerto Rico. Same thing with tell me about the African American perspective. If the student has dark skin, that doesn't necessarily mean that that student has a background from Africa. They might have been an American, like me, they might have been an American as long as they can remember. Or they might have a background from another place that allows them to have dark skin rather than Africa. So you want to be careful about, again, making them an expert. And one way to think about that is, are you an expert on your race or ethnicity? Which I'm definitely not an expert on the white race. And again, my ethnicity is probably German American, if anything. And I know very little about the German culture because, again, I've been an American as I can remember and as long as I can trace my heritage. So just kind of make sure that you consider some of these things when you're discussing race and ethnicity in your classroom.